I sat down to write this week's sermon on Wednesday, having the results of a positive COVID test in my email, and the threat of an oncoming snow and ice storm hitting us Wednesday into Thursday, coming at me from every news outlet in our city. And then, in that moment, just for a brief moment, I had the thought that this really didn't feel like part of the plan. Let me explain what I mean by that. At seminary, the pitch is come to seminary, be formed as a leader, and then go into the community to spread the gospel and develop relationships. Some days will be better than others, and that's okay. Follow the Spirit, pray unceasingly, and trust your gut. Yes, there will be ups and downs, but that's life. Kind of like the call of those first disciples in the New Testament. Jesus speaks, they follow. And yes, there are some hard days and some tricky situations. But Jesus calls them, walks with them, and then meets them throughout life and even beyond on the road to Emmaus and gathered around the table. And the other good news is that the really, really hard parts, the testing in the desert, the miracles, and the crucifixion, are all handled by Jesus. So Peter and James and John and all the others get to sit in the back of the boat, if you will, and legitimately get things wrong almost every time as they continually miss the points that Jesus is trying to teach them. So, as I sat there, in the midst of a pandemic, amid political tensions in our world, waiting for an ice storm, I thought to myself, this feels a lot harder than I expected. Not being a pastor, that's not what I'm saying at all. I mean everything else feels a lot harder. I remember being a child and thinking that adulthood would be awesome because I wouldn't have a bedtime and I could eat ice cream whenever I wanted to. Now I'm here, praying to be asleep by 9:30 most nights, and I couldn't tell you the last time I got ice cream. I say all this simply to underline that often life turns out harder than we expected it to. So let's now take a moment to consider Simon, also known as Simon Peter, or just Peter. And I'm not even talking about when he denies Jesus 3 times at the end of the gospel or things that far down the road. I'd like to look at the beginning of Simon Peter's time with Christ, when he was called, and even before that. Today's gospel reading is from Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. It is the call of Simon Peter, when Jesus says to him directly, "From now on, you will fish for people." Though in Luke's gospel, this is actually the second interaction between Jesus and Simon Peter. The first happens a chapter earlier, in chapter 4. Then, Jesus had just freed a man from an unclean spirit that was in the synagogue. Jesus exorcised this demon, and then after leaving the synagogue, he entered into Simon's house, where Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever. Now, there are 2 ways we can read this. Either A, Jesus had met Simon somewhere beforehand, knew his mother was sick, and was essentially making a house call. Or B, he just knew that there was a sick woman there, let himself into the house to heal her, and the house that he let himself into was Simon Peter's. I actually prefer the second one of these options. I like this idea that Jesus walks in where Jesus is needed, unannounced and uninvited. That's my kind of Jesus there. Jesus who doesn't need an invitation. Jesus who finds us. I think that's a powerful and true biblical image. Jesus walking into our lives uninvited to restore us to wholeness. Now, we know, because of what Jesus has taught us, that things asked in the name of the Son shall be granted. We know, because it is written, that whenever 2 or more are gathered, Jesus is in our midst, whether we come to pray or worship in the sanctuary or on Zoom. But this is Jesus coming into Simon's house of his own volition. Jesus proactively coming, restoring, healing, and caring, with no written account of a request, but simply because that is what Jesus does. Imagine you are Simon. You might have just seen this Jesus teaching in the synagogue and then exorcising a demon. Maybe, maybe not. He could have been playing hooky on that Sabbath day. Regardless, you're sitting at home. Your mother-in-law is there and with a high-grade fever. You're not sure what to do. You're worried about her. When this man walks into your home, walks into your life, and heals her. Word gets around, and for the rest of the day, until sunset, everyone in town who has or knows someone with an illness or a demon brings them to your house, where this man cures them, and then he spends the night. In the morning, he leaves. Now, I'm sure that in that spot I would have followed him too, or at least heavily considered it. Here's the guy that the town is talking about, who can heal and who can exorcise demons. Doesn't seem like a bad guy to follow. I mean, life could go a lot worse. I believe that this is a way that lots of people approach the church today. They've heard of the things. They've heard of healing, of freeing, of restoration, and of wholeness that Jesus can offer, and that sounds pretty good. That sounds like something they'd like to be part of, a path they'd like to take. And if Christ is offering healing and freedom and restoration and wholeness, then they want that. That sounds safe. It sounds like a good time. It sounds like life could go a lot worse. I find, however, that when we talk about a life of faith, we spend a lot of time talking about the healing and freedom and restoration and wholeness of God Almighty that we find and receive in Jesus Christ. We talk about how Christ comes in, coming into those moments when we are sick like Simon's mother-in-law, coming into those moments when we are scared like those who brought their loved ones to be healed, coming into those moments when Christ, the Good Shepherd, walks us through the valley of the shadow of death, crossing us over to the other side, while also sitting with all those who mourn. Christ comes in and heals and frees and restores, because that is what Jesus does. But the question I'd like to come back to is, what do we do when life turns out to be more than we expected? What do we do when nothing seems to go according to plan? And that is where our gospel reading starts. Peter is following Christ. The crowds keep growing and following too. Peter thought he could simply follow Jesus. At this point, he is one of many who have heard what was being said, and he is one of many who is following Jesus, all while still working his day job as a fisherman. They are at the lake, and a crowd of people starts pushing in on Jesus to hear the word. The crowd is growing and pressing, pushing and swelling. "Hey, Simon Peter," Jesus says, "another thing. This is getting crowded and dangerous. So why don't you take me out a little way from the shore? You know how to operate a boat." This is Jesus who cures and heals. This is Jesus who is all about healing and freedom and restoration and wholeness. And now Simon Peter has to take his work boat out because the crowd is pressing in on him, because it's getting dangerous. He's tired. He and the other fishermen have been out all night and are now cleaning up. Jesus showing up should have brought healing and freedom and restoration and wholeness, not a pressing, dangerous crowd and more work. Speaking of more work, then Jesus adds on just that. "Hey, Simon Peter, throw your nets here in the deep water and let them go down for a catch." Jesus is asking Simon Peter to do more work, legitimately his job, fishing. Simon's been up all night. He was cleaning. Then he had to take Jesus out in the boat because the crowd was pressing in on them. And now, once in the boat and out on the lake, Jesus is asking more work from him. And I'm sure it didn't really feel like ministry work. It just felt like work. Hey, fisherman, I need you to fish for me. Truthfully, I feel like this might also be reflective of the common experience of people approaching church in our modern era. They start following Jesus because, like the crowds, they have heard of Jesus' healing and freedom and restoration and wholeness. And before they know what's happening, they find other forces pressing in and are in a spot that requires more work that doesn't seem connected to that healing and freedom and restoration and wholeness that they first heard of, that they were promised. And at that moment is when people say, "This feels a lot harder than I was expecting." The following, the pressure, the work, the not knowing what's next. The question is, what did Simon Peter do? What can we learn from him? And the simple yet powerful answer is, he keeps following. He keeps trusting. Simon Peter knows that the way out of a situation is to follow where Jesus is leading. What Peter understands, or at least what he's learning here, is that what he does not know is overshadowed by what Jesus does know. What Simon Peter can't do is of no limitation to what Jesus can do. Simon Peter's weariness is of no match for Jesus' support, guidance, and care. Here, we see that when life is harder than Simon Peter expects, when life is harder than we expect, that's okay, because it's not too hard for Jesus to handle. It's not too confusing for Jesus to lead us through. In the moments we feel overwhelmed, when we feel that life is too hard, too unexpected, too lonely, when, like Peter, there is too much to do, when things are more dangerous than we thought they would be, the thing we have to do is remember that we are not alone in any of this. When Simon's mother-in-law was sick, Jesus walked in. When the crowds were pushing in, Jesus told Simon Peter to get in the boat. When Simon couldn't catch a fish, Jesus told him where to throw the nets. Throughout the Gospels, when Simon Peter doesn't seem to understand what Jesus is teaching, Jesus explains things to him time after time after time after time. So, what is the lesson that we can learn from Simon Peter? What are we to do in our lives when life turns out harder than we expected? We are to remember that we are not alone. We remember that Jesus is with us, and we let Jesus do what Jesus does. For the world is never too much for Jesus. And as the old nursery school song taught us all, he has the whole world in his hands. The whole world. That means Simon Peter, and you, and me. Thanks be to God. Amen.